to go back to our historical survey, Durant called them the ages of faith, but we know them as the Middle Ages. Middle because they span the time between the conversion of Constantine and the beginning of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance, of course, is the beginning of modern times. Now, these 10 centuries, 1,000 years, which stretched roughly up to the birth of Dante from the accession of Constantine, are incredibly treated by modern historians who pay them less and less attention as time goes by. Columbia University in New York City actually decided to drop the entire Christian ages, its entire 1,000 years of Christian history from its courses altogether. And they teach mainly ancient history and then modern history, beginning in 1666. They don't think that 1,000 years is worthy of mention. And yet it was during that particular 1,000 years, in which the Christian civilization rose to heights that exceeded all the previous civilizations of history. And yet Columbia still calls itself a university. Now, such a step betrays not only the deepest and most despicable of prejudices, but it violates the duty of teachers to their students because it denies them the knowledge of the past, which is essential to an understanding of the present. History is the record of the human race in all its experiments, its adventures, its follies, and its successes. To be ignorant of the past is to be like a person afflicted with amnesia. A person with amnesia is considered medically ill and is hospitalized. And a civilization cut off from its past is in a similar situation. But there are no hospitals large enough nor doctors wise enough to treat a nation that has lost its memory. Now, we haven't got the time today to do anything more than very briefly mention some highlights of the 1,000 years of Christianity from the 4th century to the Renaissance, let alone from the Renaissance to today. All we can do is point to a few peaks. We know, for instance, that the Christians began to speak against slavery from the 4th century onward, from the time of Constantine onward. And that, incidentally, was another breakthrough unique to the Christian civilization because slavery had existed everywhere in the world, and the Christians were the first to speak against it. From the 2nd century, they began to speak about spiritual liberty, and from the 4th, of civil equality. Now, that would be news to a great many leftist radicals today who think that they're breaking new grounds or that they're especially noble. They got all their language and all their ideas from Christianity. Christianity, therefore, brought deep political changes that appeared in the wake of the good news that God reigned and governments only administer. And this is important because, as Acton said, quote, popular governments had always existed and also mixed and federal governments, but there had been no limited government, no state whose authority had been bounded by an external force in antiquity. When Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's," those words, spoken on his last visit to the temple 3 days before his death, gave to the civil power a sacredness it had never before enjoyed, and limits it had never acknowledged. and they were the repudiation of absolutism and the inauguration of freedom. Now, of course, this did not occur immediately. Constantine's will was supreme over the church, which served as what Acton called a gilded crutch, and the vast weight of antiquity had to emerge as subtly as a language develops. It couldn't be shaken off in an instant or a generation or a few years. Self-government had to emerge as subtly as a language. There was also the great weight of the barbarian tribes, who had, however, elected their own kings and made them leaders in their councils, but not omnipotent authorities. And these were the people, the tribes of the north. Nobody knows where they came from. They came down from the north. Nobody knows where they started. Nobody knows how they moved. They came down with their own languages and their own arms, their own method of fighting, their own customs, their own languages. And as time passed, they began to migrate into the empire by the tens of thousands at first and by the hundreds of thousands later. They just crossed over, and they began to settle everywhere throughout the empire. It was a silent migration, similar to the one that we're seeing now from the south, which, of course, is going to change the culture of the United States in an irrevocable way. And as we have lost the will to stop these people from coming in, the Romans lost the will to stop them at that time. Rome went into deep decline. At a time when the Bulgarians knew the New Testament by heart, said Acton, Western Europe lay under the grasp of masters, the ablest of whom could not write their own names. The faculty of reasoning, of accurate observation, became extinct for 500 years, and even the sciences fell into decay. Only force, in the final analysis, was able to subdue the hostile and warring anti-Christian tribes of Europe and to push them into nations. In those centuries, we remember the leaders mainly, Clovis, Charlemagne, people of that sort. Meanwhile, Byzantium undertook to blend the church and state into despotism, while the West undertook the task of evangelizing and converting in an entirely different way. The bishops went out in all their robes to talk to the pagan tribes. They came from the higher classes of the dying empire. They came from the educated class. They didn't come from the slaves. These were the people who converted to Christianity and who converted the tribes of Europe to Christianity. Their information, their erudition, their grasp of speech, of eloquence, absolutely awed the most savage peoples possible to find. They had, one historian said, the wisdom of the ancient world of Cicero, of the New World via Augustine, and they were armed with irresistible arguments. The church was obviously a higher moral force than tribal governments, and the priests were made exempt from the civil authorities. These were the pioneers of the faith. And that's a story to stir the soul of the world, which is today ignored even by the churches themselves. To convert man-eaters and murderers, a task now considered impossible, was performed countless times. And in time, feudalism gained control of the land, the source of all wealth, which was the land. The barons became sovereigns in their own territory. And the only force capable of resisting complete feudal, total central authority was the church and the faith. And it was in that collision that civil liberty was born. Remember that the next time you hear condemnations of Christianity. Liberty was born in Christianity and not in any other civilization ever known. The struggle lasted 400 years, and if the church and the faith had not won, all Europe would have reverted to despotism. The rise of cities, the emergence of a middle class, the franchises won by the towns of Italy and Germany and France, the struggle between the nobles and the monarchs, all produced liberties unknown to antiquity and without precedent anywhere else. The authority of religion, Acton said, was thrown on the side that denied the indefeasible title of king. Only France insisted that the reigning house was above the law. But in other countries, the oath of fidelity attested that it was conditional and should be kept only during good behavior. And it was in conformity with the public law that monarchs were held subject. King John in England was declared a rebel against the barons, and the men who put Edward III on the throne had deposed his father. And incidentally, this went on for centuries. The people of England who finally got tired of the despotism of James I and Charles I declared Charles an enemy of the people and cut off his head in the English Civil War. The idea that the people had a right to pull down the princes providing they had the sanction of religion was expanded in time against both the kings and the church. When the church backed the Plantagenets against the House of Bruce for the possession of Scotland and Ireland, Rome backed the English. But the Irish and the Scots refused to obey the Pope. The Scots defied the Pope, claiming their liberties were not to be ruled against by any power, not even the church. What school in the United States cites this as an example in the history of liberty? Looking back over a space of 1,000 years, said Acton, which are now called the Middle Ages, to get an estimate of the work they had done toward attaining the knowledge of political truth, this is what we find. Representative government, which was unknown to the ancients, was almost universal. The methods of election were crude, but the principle that no tax was lawful that was not granted by the class that paid it, that is, that taxation was inseparable from representation, was recognized not as the privilege of certain countries, but as the right of all. Not a prince in the world, said Philip de Comines, can levy a penny without the consent of the people. Slavery was almost everywhere extinct, and absolute power was deemed more intolerable and more criminal than slavery. The right of insurrection was not only admitted but defined as a duty sanctioned by religion. Even the principles of habeas corpus and the methods of the income tax were already known. The issue of ancient politics was an absolute state planted on slavery. The political product of the Middle Ages was representation by powerful classes, by privileged associations, and by the acknowledgement of duties superior to those that are imposed by man. Most Americans not only don't know that about the Middle Ages, they don't know that about their own country. But the Middle Ages also grew rich, and riches, as the world knows, bring their own danger. The faith began to decline for multiple reasons. Some historians point to the changes ushered in by the Crusades and the expanded knowledge of other cultures, other ways. Public baths and latrines appeared in Europe in their wake, as well as the old Roman habit of shaving beards. Arabic words entered the European languages. Oriental romances appeared in European literature. And in general, the faith began to weaken. The popes, having discovered that huge sums could be raised for the Crusades, began to use similar methods for other purposes, and gradually acquired the power to tax all the subjects of Christendom right under the noses of their kings and have the money poured down toward Rome. Meanwhile, the city-states of Europe embarked on trade in the Mediterranean on a hitherto unknown scale since the days of imperial Rome. Silk, sugar, spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, all sorts of commodities once considered luxuries became commonplace. Satins, velvets, tapestries, rugs, dyes, mirrors of glass replacing polished bronze or steel, new markets developing new industries. A new economic revolution appeared in the wake of the Crusades and soon began to contend. This new money civilization began to contend with the older civilization of Christianity. One sign of this decline was that 60 years passed after the advent of printing in the 16th century before anybody undertook to print the Greek Testament. Another was the spread of the idea that unity was more important than the rights of man, and that the duties of neighbors and rulers toward them varied according to their religion, and society didn't have to acknowledge the same obligations to a Turk or a Jew, a pagan or a heretic as to an Orthodox Christian. And as the ascendancy of religion grew weaker, this privilege of treating enemies on exceptional grounds was adopted by the state for its own benefit, and the idea that the ends of government justify the means was worked into a system by Machiavelli. This was really a regression to paganism and to the attitudes of antiquity, and it wasn't the only one. How the Italians rediscovered ancient statues and dug them up in their gardens and began to brush the dust off old manuscripts and to read the pagan writings and literature is a very interesting tale. A lot of modern historians have made a career out of talking about how wonderful the Renaissance was, how it rediscovered the business of poetry, how it put out laurel wreaths for poetic prizes. The Italians began to talk about their ancestors, although the Romans had been dead for 800 or 900 years and there weren't any Romans left in Italy. They began to invent genealogies for themselves. There was another race living by that time. And none of this was quite as innocent as it seems to be. When Petrarch, who was a combination writer and blackmailer and pornographer, made his first visit to Rome, he saw the statues and the ruins, and he was so awe-stricken, he said those were the days of glory. And the 1,000 years of Christianity he called the Dark Ages. And that single phrase has done Christianity more damage than anything I can think of. Just those three words, the Dark Ages. Those were the ages that built everything that the Renaissance built upon. Italy underwent a metamorphosis. Its attention turned from the shrines of Christendom to the temples and groves of the pagan past. From the next world to fame in this world. Fame, just as in the pagan days, began to be the yardstick by which a man felt that his name could remain alive. And today we call it celebrity, the cult of celebrity. A very ancient pagan idea, restored in Italy first, and other parts of Western Europe later. And also darker aspects of paganism began to reappear. Machiavelli, looking at the power chase in Florence, wrote that conscience could interfere with a rational form of government and that all should be permitted the state. Dr. Schirmacher spoke about that belief last night as it was applied in Germany and in Russia. All should be permitted to state. And this doctrine was used and is still used by men in authority to excuse themselves in the exercise of unlimited power. James I of England, a shameful creature, said, "I rule not according to the common will, but to the common weal." Public morality, in his eyes and in the eyes of other Renaissance rulers, was that public morality differs from the private because no government can turn the other cheek or admit that mercy is better than justice. In effect, Machiavelli gave European monarchs the rationale to break out of the bonds of the faith and the right to assume that no authority could be higher than a government, and we have a constitution which says that. Ferdinand I and Ferdinand II and Henry III and Louis XIII each caused their most powerful subjects to be treacherously murdered. Elizabeth I and Mary Stuart attempted to do the same to each other. The way was paved for absolute monarchy. The right of the people to resist oppression was denied, and all the evil aspects of Rome and Greek civilization were reinstalled after 1,500 years, including torture. In one generation, the hard-won liberties of Europe were overturned during times of increasing opulence and wealth, expansion and development. And some historians make the mistake of linking the advance of technology with the decline of faith to imply that faith had kept them from developing before, when, of course, there was no relation between the two. They were really beginning to build upon the inheritance of their forebears. Now, the decline of the faith in Rome during the Renaissance is an interesting thing, but it's hardly worth talking about. If we want to know what it's really like, we could take a look at New York City, where they have live sex shows on Madison Square, and where all sorts of horrible things go on, and in other cities of the United States. We are living through a replay of the Renaissance, in which our technology is rising and our morals are declining. And Italy's faith was terrible. Luther went down there in 1517 or so and said there was everything in Rome but an honest man. But within 10 years, Rome was attacked by a mercenary army dominated by Spanish troops joined by Germans and some Italian mercenaries. It was attacked and sacked in one of the most terrible sieges of all time. And Italy never recovered. From then on, it was under the reign, under the rule of one foreign power or another. To this day, there's no real Italian nation. They come from separate villages, they come from cities. A man from Italy never describes himself as Italian. He says, "I'm from Genoa, I'm from Rome." They never recovered. They lost their ascendancy. It moved farther up to the north. Mr. Luther, however, had to ally with some of the princes of Germany in order to save his Reformation. He was shocked when revolution appeared, when really it was a sign of the nature of the times. A man firm in his faith, he said, in the divinity and redeeming sacrifice of Christ enjoys not freedom of will, but the profoundest freedom of all, freedom from his own carnal nature, from all evil powers, from damnation, even from law. For the man whose virtue flows spontaneously from his faith needs no command to righteousness. And that argument lit the fires of the revolution across the landscape. A fantastic thing. No civilization, so far as I know, had ever come so close to falling off the cliff as did the Christian civilization in the times of the Renaissance. It recovered because of the Reformation. Every other civilization that's ever come that close to losing its faith has gone over the cliff and lost its faith and lost everything with it. Only the Christians pulled back from that precipice. And that's, I think, a very important point. We cannot, of course, go through all the various reformers. I'd love to, but I'm not allowed to. Clint won't let me. And there was considerable argument about what was permissible to Christians when they're oppressed by unchristian or anti-Christian rulers. Zwingli did not shrink from the medieval doctrine that evil magistrates must be cashiered, but he was killed too early to really get very far with that argument. And the great leader, of course, was Calvin, who had probably the worst press, and still has, of any Christian leader in the history of our civilization. He was surrounded by mass murderers, and yet he had a bad press. His only position was as a pastor, a church pastor in Geneva, where when he got there he said he found the gospel but no church. His influence was entirely intellectual, which was described by inferior minds as unjust and tyrannical. So much for being smarter than the other fellow. In his own time he baptized babies and performed weddings and tended the sick and presided at funerals and preached and wrote his commentaries, which he called institutes, and that hardly seems like despotic activity. And he ran afoul of the authorities, and especially of the libertines, the party that wanted to be free of the rules of the church while continuing to attend the church. And when Calvin excommunicated some of these free thinkers, the city council, which had authority over him, insisted that they be uncommunicated, so to speak, that he take them back. And he refused. And the struggle stretched over several years. And in the end, he won. And we owe to him the principle of the separation of church and state. And it's very odd that that great victory is always overlooked. Not occasionally, but always. For it's one of the greatest steps toward liberty ever achieved. Up until then, the church and the state had been allied. And it was achieved by a small, sickly, slender man with no civil authority, no office except an appointed one, no soldiers, no money, but a following throughout all Europe who knew him only through his books. No Christian theologian, said one writer, is so often scorned, so regularly attacked. He is a devil figure for anti-Christians and even for many imperfectly educated Christians. And this is odd, for Americans do not ordinarily attack religious leaders of faith. Even the Ayatollah Khomeini, inspirer of a bloody purge, was not used as a peg upon which to attack Islamic belief. But there's long been an open season on Calvin, and I guess you could gauge his importance by that fact. Because inferior people hate the very idea of superiority. And in the long run, which always clarifies what at first seems mysterious, it seems that Calvin's great crime in the eyes of many was that he preached that God's grace is irresistible and that it falls wherever he chooses, and those he chooses are known only to him. Calvin, a citizen of a republic, called this similar to an election, and he called him the elect. But he didn't name the elect. His opponents in Protestantism, led by the theories of Jacobus Arminius, argued that this may be true, but that nobody could be so elected without his own consent and outside of the church and its leaders. Now, that's an argument with which we are today very familiar. God is weeping out in the corridor and you call him in for room service. On that organizational argument, which in effect returned much of Protestantism to the policies of the Vatican, hangs the odium upon which Calvin has been shrouded. But despite the tangled arguments of the Reformation, it did succeed in restoring the impetus that Christianity had lost during the Renaissance and pulled it back. A remarkable thing, because it only lasted 2 generations in its founding period. It wasn't a very long time. And the Renaissance had lasted 3.5 centuries. Now, other civilizations have committed suicide. The Greeks committed suicide. The Egyptians committed suicide. There is a historical theory to the effect that no great civilization is ever conquered. It only commits suicide. And this is true even when a civilization that is rotting at the core continues to be dynamic at the periphery, as in the cases of Greece and Rome. Spain, for example, discovered the New World as far as Europe was concerned. And what did it find? It found paganism. The Europeans were astonished to discover it in its pure form. They had forgotten what it was like after they had become converted and civilized. The Spanish priest discovered human sacrifice in the Yucatan on a scale unknown and to a depth of cruelty unseen since the days of the Scythians. The human sacrifice was basic to the Aztecs, and scenes describing these sacrifices were put in sculpture and in drawings and set in clay all throughout the Americas, especially in the Yucatan and in Peru. In the records of the Spanish priests, which were put down as prejudice, as propaganda, have been proven in recent years to have been factual and honest. That sacrifices were not invented by the Aztecs, but preceded by the Toltecs and the Mayas, the Olmecs and the Huertas. All Central America was drenched in blood as far back as recorded time. And those who deplore the Spanish practice of destroying the idols should be made more aware during their denunciations of Christianity of the careful translations and records made by the Spanish priests, their conversions, and the peace that they finally brought to that turbulent era. Early in the 1500s, they had universities for the natives. And of course, that was only the beginning. As Christian Europe expanded around the globe, Europeans discovered similar scenes everywhere. And the sacrifices were everywhere, and they were all religious. In India, pervaded by cults and sacrifices, the custom of burning widows together with the cadavers of their husbands was common and was not the only instance. The English were baffled by people who thought that killing a cow was worse than killing a man, as Dr. Schermacher reminded us last night, who buried young women alive, who threw their children to crocodiles at the mouth of the Ganges. These practices went back, they were recorded back as far as 1500 BC. And the numberless gods of India all had their own sacrifices, including the Thuggis. And yet, when I was a young man, the denunciations of Great Britain for its ownership of India were unending. I grew up, I cut my teeth on denunciations of the British Empire. And what did they accomplish? Well, they stopped the internecine wars of that subcontinent that gave them a common language for the first time in all their history. And now we see the practices are seeping back into Indian life. Brides are being burned alive again so that the husbands can get another dowry from another bride. Abortion The modern version of ancient infanticide is rampant, and a shortage of female children is one result in the Oriental area, in China and in India. And here, the demographics of our population mix have been distorted. They're telling us now that in the year 2020 there won't be enough workers, enough young workers to take care of the elderly that will be alive at that point. Well, of course, if you kill the young, how are you going to have them grow up to take care of the elderly? I mean, 25 million abortions meant 50 million children. 50 million children by 2020 would mean 100 million more citizens. Plenty of young people to take care of the old people, but not, of course, if they're dead. And what Europe discovered in Black Africa is hardly ever mentioned today. Black Africa in the 19th century, and not a long time ago. Both my grandparents, all four of my grandparents were alive in 1880 when the Europeans decided to go into interior Africa. And they ran into things which, like the Leopard Society of Sierra Leone, where men dressed in leopard skins captured and sacrificed human beings for centuries, even under the noses of the English. They were very clever. They actually had to create a protectorate to end it. And then they discovered the Leopard Society had been joined by a Human Alligator Society that expanded the sacrifices. And it's unfortunate that the European explorers and colonizers paid much more attention to the overt results of those religions than they did to the essence of the religions themselves. And that revealed to me that they did not understand what Christianity had brought to the world by the 1880s, 1890s, 1900, 1910. They were no longer carrying out the principles of Christianity. By 1910, they didn't know as much as the Spaniards did in 1520 about Christianity. Now, none of these terrible practices, India and the rest of the place, could have been halted by brute force alone, by police work alone. It had to be done by conversion. And it was done by conversion. But now, of course, the missionary outreach is declining. The conversions are of a different nature. They're eclectic. They're a blend of pagan and Christian practices. And I talked to some theologians in South Africa who thought that this was a step forward and this was pretty good. I wasn't so sure. And we don't know as much as we should about the black civilizations because they didn't keep imperishable records. They built in clay. We know that their sacrifices were the same as they were in other parts of the world, but we did not really become acquainted with them as people. We didn't examine their beliefs the way the Spaniards examined the beliefs, let us say, of the Aztecs. There's been a decline, if you will. There's been a decline in the level of cultural understanding and a rise in the level of technology. So we're getting better and better mechanics that are stupider and stupider. And by the 19th century, of course, we also suffered as a civilization from the re-establishment of the ancient theory of evolution, which has spurred a flight from the faith. Western governments now place Christianity on the same level as witchcraft and Satanism. Universities founded by Christian churches now take great pride in barring Christians from their faculties and from their classrooms. A recent New York dialogue on the subject was entitled, "Does the West Really Exist?" And that's significant, because the West is a term, as Dr. Rushdoony mentioned, that replaced the old references to Christendom. And I believe Winston Churchill was the last Western statesman to refer to Christendom. So meanwhile, the great civilization known as Christendom has both shriveled and darkened. Its ranks are eroded by massive immigrations, similar to the immigrations that once swamped Rome. They're not simply flooding in to the southwest of the United States. They're flooding into Italy, they're flooding into Germany, they're flooding into France, they're flooding into England. There's going to be a common passport. We are seeing immigrations on a level that the world has not seen since the decline of Rome. And the parallels are impossible not to notice. One result has been the rise of pagan beliefs and practices. Not very long ago, 2 or 3 years at the most, human sacrifices were discovered along the Mexican border. Human rights are often discussed and seldom enjoyed. The 44 million people that were murdered in Los Angeles in the wake of the riots down there did not enjoy very many human rights. And the perpetuators are free so far as we know. We are, it seems, in the midst of another Renaissance, because the Renaissance, which most people don't seem to recall, was also marred by violent scenes in the city-states of Italy. Violent, mass murders. We see the art, the Madonna and Child, the saints and the angels and so forth, and we don't realize that that was advertising for a great organization known as the church. The reality was much different, much less peaceful. And we're back in the days of the Renaissance when paganism was regarded as the real days of glory. And the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation today are considered simply another aspect of the Dark Ages. So as we see the mainline churches crumbling, new and more fervent, smaller congregations emerging on all sides. It's a very interesting phenomenon. We see Christian schools appearing, and many are on the verge of finally deciding that they don't need to be accredited by a corrupt educational establishment. That it's more important to educate students than it is to get them a piece of paper, especially when the pieces of paper are accompanied by dishonest grades awarded on basis of race and ethnicity and certain political positions that the professor likes, and instead provide them with a real education without a piece of paper. But if you have the education, you don't need a piece of paper. I can attest to that because I have no formal education. Christian books outsell all others in the marketplace, and our politicians, although they pretend not to be, are very upset over the fact that somehow or another populace is not happy with them. People don't want to vote in this election. They say there's no choice. It's a choice between a couple of idiots. So a new reformation, a new reconstruction is visible on the horizon. Not large, but you know how dawn comes, little lights along a certain sector of the horizon. Suddenly it gets light over here. I believe that what occurred once will occur again. The world's greatest civilization, having gone through a fever for the last 150 years, or roughly since the French Revolution, will, I believe, rise again, greater than ever, not through our efforts, although they will come along, but because Almighty God promised us not defeat, but victory forever, in this world and the next.